Cessna's 172 family of aircraft, the Beech Bonanza, and at the other end of the scale, the Learjet. The Learjet brought style and luxury and the speed of jet power to corporate aircraft. It began life as a failed prototype for a Swiss jet fighter. American Bill Lear turned it into the most famous corporate jet of all time. The Piper Cub dates back to the 1930s, and some of the Cubs from that era somehow got into the air with engines that produced only 40 horsepower. Cubs were cheap, and they made flying accessible to thousands. Equipped with a 65 horsepower Continental, they had a top speed of 96 miles an hour, and in a headwind could be outrun by an automobile. The military used them during the war, and by war's end, 14,000 civilian models and 5,700 military versions had been sold. New models were introduced post-war, including the famous Super Cub.
The first time that you start regularly seeing airplanes parked in farmers' backyards is with the Piper Cub. The Piper Cub becomes synonymous with affordable flying for the ordinary man.
Before that aircraft was out there, if I had been around during those times, I couldn't have afforded to have flown until that Cub came out.
If we'd been doing this 30 years ago, everybody would say Piper Cab, but tailwheel airplanes are passé, and everybody knows about nose-wheel airplanes, and the 172, again, I think it's the largest, most produced airplane in history now.
The 172 was the first of Cessna's light aircraft with tricycle landing gear. The family of aircraft it spawned is the all-time best-selling light aircraft in the world. In its first year of production, 1956, the company had sales of almost 1,200. There are now tens of thousands of them scattered across the globe.
The 172 was originally built after the Cessna 170, which was manufactured around 1946 to about 1956. And it's easy to fly, it has great visibility, and it carries 4 passengers quite safely. So it met a huge market. It can be used as a family airplane, or it can be used as a trainer. The Cessna 172 monoplane design actually dates back to the early 30s when Clyde Cessna was a firm believer that the future of aviation was in monoplanes, not biplanes, which were so popular at that time. This particular design incorporates a strut, which is very rugged. Interestingly enough, at this point in time, the Cessna 172 is the most popular airplane in the world. There are more Cessna 172s flying in the world than all the other aircraft combined. This particular airplane carries about 36 gallons of fuel, which gives it a range of between 400 and 500 miles. As you can see, the aircraft is equipped with dual controls, which makes it very practical from a flight training point of view. This particular aircraft still has the original rudder pedals in it, which are very typical of its date. To flyers of more modern Cessnas, this will be a little foreign, and these are manual flaps we have that are unique to this vintage of aircraft.
I used to go into Cessna on business, and that is quite a factory. And they build these things the way General Motors builds cars. And the technical expertise that goes into them, into the heat treating, into the protection of the surfaces and everything else on the aircraft is just, they're very good at it.
I think it's fair to say that when they really were in production, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, clearly mass-produce them in order to bring the price down, and that's why you find so many of them out there.
Our panel had no hesitation in picking the Cessna 172 as the best light utility aircraft.
If you had the bucks and you wanted to buy an airplane, a 172 is a darn good way to go. It's just a good all-around airplane.
Airliners have transformed the world, enabling countless millions to cross continents and oceans. Aircraft have constantly grown bigger and faster. Flightpath asked our panel to select the airliner that has had the greatest impact on air travel since aircraft started carrying passengers in the 1920s. The Douglas DC-3, the Lockheed Constellation, Boeing's 707, or its giant 747, or the supersonic Concorde. Douglas's DC-3 holds an honored place in aviation history. It was the first airliner in the world that could make money without a government mail contract. Passenger mileage in the U.S. increased 600% between 1936, when the DC-3 entered and dominated airline service, until World War II. It was that magic combination of airframe and engines that all aircraft designers seek but seldom attain, and an early favorite with our panel.
The Douglas DC-3 is a remarkable success story. And this is important. It could take off from the highest airport around on one engine with a full load. Now, we almost take for granted now that airplanes, if they lose one engine, they can sustain with the additional engines. This is still something that was kind of a new thing back then, and it only came about because engine design had evolved to the point where this was possible.
90% of the world's airlines were using the DC-3. It was absolutely revolutionary in every way because it was much better performer seat per mile. So I didn't have much hesitation with the DC-3.
To me, that DC-3, with its A, as a pioneer, and B, the extraordinary fact that such a pioneer aircraft could go on and on and on, and is still flying today in places and earning its keep. A combination of all of that, to me, makes it impossible to pick anything else.
DC-3 is just one of those planes that I'm sure will keep on going for another 25 or 50 years as long as you can get a hold of an engine.
Lockheed's Constellation was on the drawing board in 1939 when 3 American airlines asked the company to build a 40-passenger aircraft for domestic service. Production was halted by the war, but Constellations were flying 64 passengers in luxury from New York to Paris by February 1946. 856 were built, but they had piston engines, and jets soon drove them from the skies.
To get more power, the designers had packed them with pistons. They were, in fact, they used to be called the corncob engines because if you open them up, they're just rows and rows of pistons. They were extremely difficult to maintain. The pilots used to say the most expensive cars at an airport were owned by mechanics because they had to put in overtime changing the pistons. I fell in love with the Lockheed Constellation because of its shape. No aircraft has ever had a shape like that, and it's still my favorite plane today.
The Constellation is, in my view, the most beautiful airplane. It maximizes the design, aerodynamics of an aircraft. It's just a terrific airplane. You don't see a lot of them around. They got beat out by jets at the end, but there's just nothing quite like it. It's the peak of that technology, and then after that, it ended.
Boeing 707 is the airliner credited with launching the age of jet travel. It started life as the KC-135 military tanker, so Boeing could get the U.S. Air Force to pay the cost of developing and tooling for a civilian version. In the event, Boeing sold more than 800 tankers. The 707 airliner went into service with Pan Am in 1958. A year later, the long-range 707-320 emerged. Almost 1,000 were built over the next 30 years. It could carry 147 passengers, 5,700 miles.
The Boeing 707 really brought in the commercial age of jet transport. You had to build a big enough airplane that could carry enough passengers, and the more passengers you could carry, the more productive the airplane was.
The 747 was the biggest financial gamble in aviation history. When the first aircraft went into service with Pan Am in 1970, the company had orders for 190 jumbo jets from 28 airlines. It still wasn't close to covering its development costs, but in the end, the gamble paid off. The 747, one of the world's most successful aircraft ventures.
When the 747 came in, what happened to the fares? They went down, and everybody could travel. Up until that time, basically, travel was the privilege of the people who had a higher income. Without the 747, the era of mass travel would never have arrived.
I think the 747 has to be recognized. You know, I was a kid on the ferries in Western Canada. Well, if somebody walked up to you then and said, you know, in 50 years, there's going to be an airplane flying 9 miles above the surface of the Earth. It's going to be carrying 500 people, and it's going to be going 550 miles an hour. Well, they would have been laughed off the face of the Earth. Well, there it is. It came to pass. It's that airplane that's really done it.
Britain and France collaborated to build the Mach 2.2 Aerospatiale British Aerospace Concorde, the world's first and only supersonic airliner. The Concorde represents a giant leap in aviation technology. Its nose tilts forward for pilot visibility on the ground. To maintain its angle of attack in the transition to supersonic flight, batteries of pumps have to move its fuel into different tanks.
I worked on the Concorde. That was my first job. Now, the Concorde is the first attempt to have a supersonic transport. It's still a very interesting design. The shape of that wing is very special. It has all kinds of twists and funny curves in it you don't expect to have there, but it makes it a very efficient airplane. You can design a larger Concorde if you want, and it's a matter of engines. At that time, there were no other engines available, and that's why the Concorde was limited to 80 or 100 passengers.
The Douglas DC-3, the early favorite, was in the end our panel's overwhelming choice for the outstanding airliner in aviation's first century.
The DC-3 was probably the most famous aircraft ever designed. It was just the perfect airplane. They couldn't have made it any better.
The shattering roar of jet fighters making a low-level pass down the field is a crowd pleaser at every air show. Fighters are swift and powerful, capable of tremendous destruction, masters of the air. Over the last half of the 20th century, the performance and firepower of jet fighters have increased dramatically. They have become devastating weapons of war. We asked our panel which jet fighter is the epitome of the breed. The North American F-86 Sabre, the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-21, McDonnell's F-4 Phantom, British Aerospace's Harrier, or General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon. The first aerial combat between jet fighters took place in the skies over North Korea. Soviet MiG-15s fought American F-86 Sabres. The MiGs could climb higher and faster, but they were dangerously unstable in sharp turns. Better trained American pilots racked up a kill ratio of 10 to 1. The F-86 first flew in 1947 and eventually broke the sound barrier in a shallow dive. but it was essentially a subsonic fighter. From its success in Korea, the F-86 went on to become the primary fighter for air forces throughout the Western world. 6,000 were built in the U.S., 1,800 in Canada. Others came off production lines in Japan and Australia.
Well, I've flown the F-86 about 400 hours, as opposed to a lot of jet aircraft of that era, which had the engine intakes on the wing roots. They decided to put this one right in the center of the airplane, which means that you have a straight through flow of air. The pilot then has to sit on top of it. The armament was very good for its day. 650 caliber machine guns, which made quite a potent dogfight weapon in close. As a day fighter in a dogfight, this aircraft had no peers. The Sabre was one of the first early aircraft to have what is called a flying tail. And that's where the whole horizontal stabilizer of the aircraft moves up and down. And this was one of the early airplanes that had that.
It had good range, it was good for fighting. The pilots could handle it at a high altitude. But for the first time, you've got an ejection seat, you've got good heat, and of course if you're up high, you need that heat.
The McCoy and Gurevich design group came up with the MiG-21 after the MiG-15's disastrous experiences in Korea. It was a much improved aircraft and an excellent weapons platform. Thousands were produced. 39 air forces were equipped with the MiG-21, making it the world's most extensively used jet fighter.
In talking with guys who flew the Phantom in Vietnam against the MiG-21, who'd flown both airplanes, the MiG-21 is simple, rugged, purpose-built, and it's still being used. I mean, the MiG-21 is the classic example of an airplane that was so good it can continue on and continue to be effective.
The McDonnell F-4 Phantom, two-seater fighter bomber, was the U.S. response to the MiG-21. Over 5,000 Phantoms were built, more than any other jet built in the Western world over the past 40 years. Phantoms carried 16,000 pounds of bombs or missiles. One speed record it set held for 16 years. It was bought by the U.S. Marines, Air Force, and Navy, and by 11 allied nations.
It was just a workhorse. It was crammed with electronic countermeasures, equipment and radars and all sorts of electronic equipment, to the point where some of the pilots are actually turning off some of their systems because there's only so much that a pilot can attend to. And I think this is the first time in history where aeronautical designers are realizing that you can design a lot of capability into an aircraft, but if the pilot is just biologically not capable to attend to everything, it causes a problem, and the Phantom was one of the first aircraft that this problem cropped up in.
British Aerospace's incomparable Harrier, a dramatic departure in jet fighter design, capable of vertical takeoffs and landings.
The very first time that I saw a Harrier was at the Farnborough Air Show, and I couldn't believe my eyes. And I said, this is incredible that we can have jets doing that.
The Harrier takes off and lands on the exhaust of its single turbofan engine, vectored through 4 nozzles that pivot through 90 degrees. At safe altitude, the Harrier's nozzles swing toward the tail, and it becomes a conventional jet. The idea goes back to 1957, and the prototype flew in 1960. Both a single-seater and two-seater were designed, and the RAF took delivery of both in 1969. The U.S. Marine Corps took one look at the Harrier and decided it was ideal for the close support of marine landings. Harriers fly with the British, Italian, Indian, and Spanish navies. They saw combat during the Falklands War in 1982, where they took a heavy toll of Argentine jets without the loss of a single Harrier in combat.
I went to my first lecture on the Harrier, given by Sir Stanley Hooker. I think it was in 1959, or maybe it was even 1958. And this was a truly remarkable aeroplane. The concept was so extremely simple. It was really a single engine with a single extra lever that moved the nozzles down, and you could operate vertical takeoff, conventional takeoff, short takeoff. You could even fly backwards. The Harrier has shown that it has been flying around for some 35 years or more in frontline service, and still nothing has come along to challenge it.
The fact that it could do a helicopter takeoff, and the fact that you didn't need 10,000 feet of runway to get it in the air, I think that in itself was a tremendous jump forward in technology, and yet it was still pretty fast enough to be effective in the air as a jet fighter.
The current jet fighter of choice for some 20 nations around the world is the General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon. It's a single-seater hot rod. Its avionics have been upgraded constantly since the first F-16 was handed over to the U.S. Air Force in 1978. And it's a test bed for new fighter technology, including voice command systems. New orders for the Fighting Falcon are still coming in.
It's been around an awfully long time. We're still using them. It simply is a tremendous platform that you can, depending on avionics and the armament that you put on it, can produce a wide variety of missions.
But to members of our panel, one fighter emerged from the pack. It's the classic clean-lined F-86 Sabre.
I think on balance it has to be said that that was the real spearheader of jet fighter warfare. To me, it was the supreme aircraft of its time.
Occasionally, over the past century, designers have conceived aircraft so unique, so original, they've become the milestones of aviation's progress. The category is special purpose aircraft. Aircraft built with one seemingly impossible goal in mind. To build aircraft that could meet these goals demanded imagination, innovation, and a large measure of engineering genius. In this category, the Wright brothers Flyer, the NASA Rockwell Space Shuttle, Bell's rocket-powered X-1, Burt Rutan's Voyager, and Lockheed's SR-71 Blackbird. The Wright brothers' goal for the Flyer was to achieve powered, controlled human flight. The historic first flight lasted a mere 12 seconds and carried Orville 120 feet, but they reached their goal. By 1905, in the Flyer 3, Orville and Wilbur Wright were able to stay aloft for 29 minutes and cover 24 miles.
Well, I mean, those are the guys who started it all. Didn't have any training, trained themselves, figured out how to do it. I'm just impressed that with what they were able to do with so little knowledge.
But the real basic problems in flight were pretty daunting at that time, and they worked through it methodically. They even built themselves a little wind tunnel and then tried the different contours of wings, and they could read how much lift they were getting from each contour. The propeller was the same thing. They just did that empirically. I think they went through a lot of designs before they came up with something that was good enough to get them in the air.
When the Wrights turn up in Europe in 1908 to demonstrate their Wright Flyer, they immediately literally fly circles around the competition. They can take off, they can make turns, they can do figure eights, they can land without it being a controlled crash. The French, in particular, say it is obvious that this is how flight is supposed to be. It is not supposed to be a suicidal hurling of oneself into the air. It is supposed to be graceful and controlled.
Bell's X-1, X for experimental. Its sole purpose was to burst through the little understood sound barrier. In October 1949, test pilot Chuck Yeager rolled away from a B-29 and pushed the rocket-powered X-1 to 670 miles an hour at 42,000 feet, or Mach 1.015. The Rattan Voyager was built by the brilliant California-based designer Burt Rattan. His goal, a non-stop flight around the world. With Dick Rattan and Gina Yeager piloting, Voyager flew almost 25,000 miles in 9 days, 3 minutes, and 42 seconds without refueling. The NASA Rockwell Space Shuttle is an extraordinary special-purpose aircraft. Hurled aloft on giant rockets, it has to carry crews and cargoes into space. When its space mission is completed, the shuttle must endure the 3,000-degree Fahrenheit temperatures that build up on its nose and the leading edges of its wings on re-entry, and then make a controlled landing.
The space shuttle. I have to pick the space shuttle. First time that we were able to go into space safely and come back. Again, a quantum leap.
They started using that 15 years ago, maybe, and they're still using it. You know, instead of a throwaway rocket, they're taking this plane to space. So I think it's just a great tool, and it's also a great concept.
When we go on a Mars mission or deep space mission, I mean, the stepping stone is going to be the space shuttle. And if there's a cutting edge to manned space flight, where you actually fly something, they're going to be space shuttle type vehicles.
U-2 spy planes were slow, but the U.S. Air Force believed they flew at altitudes far beyond the reach of Soviet missiles. When the Russians shot one down in 1960, U-2 flights ended, and U.S. intelligence no longer had current photographs of Soviet nuclear bases. In great secrecy, a new and astonishing aircraft emerged to replace the U-2. It was designated the SR-71 Blackbird. It had to be built primarily of titanium, because when cruising at Mach 3 at altitudes up to 80,000 feet, parts of its structure had to endure temperatures of 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. The Blackbird shattered countless aviation records. Its performance has never been equaled. It once flew from New York to Britain's Farnborough Air Show in 1 hour, 55 minutes, 42 seconds.
It was an aircraft that could fly at altitudes in excess of 70,000 feet. It could fly at Mach 3. And of course, to do this, they had to come up with innovations. One of the unique things was the way they cooled it. They used the fuel in the wings to cool the wings. And these aircraft would actually be fueled up, and they would be leaking. There'd be fuel being pumped around. And they would take off, and then they would come up behind a tanker, and the tanker would refill them again. And then they were on their way at Mach 3 at 70,000 feet plus.
Now, I've flown a Concorde at twice the speed of sound, and of course, whereas a very few fighters or things can do it for more than 15 minutes at a time. But the SR-71 goes a long distance, too, at very high speeds. So it is totally unique.
So actually, I'd say that the Blackbird represents about as high a speed as a jet aircraft will go, and but Mach 3 is about the upper limit of what a jet-propelled aircraft can do.
That Blackbird was the most incredible aeroplane. Even now, today, when did it first come into service 30 years ago? Even today, it is unsurpassed in its performance and its ability to fly enormous distances at enormous heights and enormous speeds, to the extent that it's virtually impossible to intercept it.
The Wright Flyer and the Space Shuttle had their champions. But in the end, Flightpath's panel selected Lockheed's SR-71 Blackbird, a dazzling achievement of aeronautical design and technology.
It's just such a unique aircraft. There's just so much cutting-edge technology that the Blackbird has always impressed me.
And finally, we asked our aviators and experts to select from these 10 superb aircraft the one that best symbolizes the enormous strides made by aviation in its first century. The one aircraft that stands out from all the others. The best all-around aircraft of the last 100 years. The issue was never in doubt.
The best aircraft for its time over the past 100 years, I would have to say, is the DC-3.
And I was bound to select the Douglas DC-3.
The one that to me jumps out, if you look back over that 100-year period, is going to be the DC-3. And I think a lot of airplanes are more technologically sophisticated. A lot of airplanes' combat histories are more glamorous or whatever. But aviation is a utilitarian operation in essence, and what better airplane to kind of be the hallmark of 100 years than an airplane that...
Based on speed, design, power, and technology. So sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight as we blast off on the most extraordinary jets to ever conquer the skies. Our countdown begins with a jet so sexy, it will make you wish you hadn't missed it. But you can still fantasize about every imaginable pleasure served to you at 60,000 feet. With its long, flowing lines and eye-popping shape, this is the sexiest supermodel of the skies. Our number 7 wonder of jets is the Concorde, a wonder of beauty.